We are back with my James Bond series. Welcome back to my 5th entry in my No Time to Die Bondathon, where I'm reviewing every official James Bond movie leading up to No Time to Die in April. I've already talked about Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and Thunderball. I meant to use those as background props, but today I'm going to be talking about the 5th James Bond film, then the 5th to star Sean Connery in the title role, and that is You Only Live Twice.
You only live twice, or so it seems.
You Only Live Twice sends Bond to Japan to investigate the capture of an American space capsule and a Russian space capsule. Bond investigates Mr. Osato, the main villain of You Only Live Twice. He might be behind all these thefts, but the more that Bond learns, he actually learns that it's the criminal and terrorist organization Spectre, led by Ernst Stavro Blofeld, played by Donald Pleasance, that is actually behind these thefts. And he captured these space capsules to evoke war between the two superpowers because this was the height of the Cold War, while Bond goes toe-to-toe for the first time with Spectre's #1. Blofeld. I'm gonna be quite honest with you guys. I never used to really like You Only Live Twice on my first viewings of this movie. The second half of this movie, which I'll talk about a lot more. Oh, by the way, these reviews, if I haven't mentioned them to this point in the series, will contain spoilers. So if you get to see any of the previous Bond movies I've talked about, or this one, or any of the other Bond movies I'm going to be talking about, you have been warned this is spoilers. But yes, so I've never really liked You Only Live Twice. The first couple of times I saw it, I always thought that it was one of those weirder Bond films. It has a bit of a sci-fi edge to it in the second half of the movie, and the second half of this movie always used to drag it down for me on watching this movie for the first time and even subsequent rewatches. However, even though I do feel as if the second half of the movie is a bit weaker as opposed to the first half, I think You Only Live Twice is actually a fairly underrated Bond film. I find this, next to Goldfinger, to be the most entertaining of the Sean Connery Bond films. Sure, From Russia with Love is better, Dr. No is better, but I think that this is actually better than Thunderball. It's a lot more entertaining, it's a lot more intense. One thing I've always loved about You Only Live Twice is that this takes place in one location instead of having Bond going on a globe-trotting adventure. Those are fun, and it's always interesting to see where Bond goes on his adventure, but it's really interesting that this movie just keeps it in one locale, and that is Japan, and it makes complete sense with the way the story is written. Now, talking about that script, this was written by Roald Dahl, who you might know from certain childhood chapter books. Yeah, he wrote the script. Richard Maibaum was out, and apparently when Roald Dahl read the book for You Only Live Twice, he decided to change the story because he felt that Ian Fleming's novel did not have a plot, so he came up with this plot on the fly, therefore making You Only Live Twice the first Bond film to deviate from Ian Fleming's original novel. Sure, there were differences in the other ones, but they mostly kept the same plot intact. This one actually comes up with an entirely new story. This is one of the few Bond books I have yet to read, so I'm really curious to see what the actual plot of the You Only Live Twice novel actually was, as opposed to what happens in this movie and what transpires in this movie. And again, as I said, I think You Only Live Twice is actually a very underrated Bond film. This is one where in my previous few rewatches, I've actually grown accustomed to liking a lot. It's definitely middle of the pack Bond for me. There's definitely a bunch more Bond films that I like, but this used to be near the bottom of the list. It's slowly creeping up because it's so damn entertaining, especially for its time. This was released in 1967, the first time a Bond film had been released at a 2-year interval. They had all come out back to back to back, all come out 1 year after each other, and this is the first time we actually had a gap for a Bond film. But You Only Live Twice is just so entertaining, and again, I love how this takes place in one location instead of sending Bond on a globe-trotting adventure. This is definitely the most action-packed of the Sean Connery Bond films. I think that that's why I find this movie to be a lot better than people make it out to be. It's also got one of my favorite sidekicks to ever pair with Bond, and that is Tiger Tanaka. This dude is awesome. He's charismatic. He's part of the Japanese Secret Service. The headquarters is in like a subway. That's fucking awesome. Tiger Tanaka is basically this movie's Felix Leiter, and I'm really okay with that because he's actually a really good ally for Bond. They actually gave him a lot to do, and they actually had him aid Bond on his adventure and his investigation into Mr. Osato and eventually Spectre's dealings with these space capsules. And we gotta talk about Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who is finally revealed in this movie after kind of being like an Emperor Palpatine type of person. And From Russia with Love and Thunderball, and he wasn't in Dr. No, but we had heard about Spectre in Dr. No, so he's finally revealed here, and he is played by Donald Pleasence, and he is great! I love Donald Pleasence. He is actually my favorite Blofeld put on screen. You know why? Because as much as I love Telly Savalas in On Her Majesty's Secret Service as Blofeld, and I think he brings a little bit more charisma and more maturity to the role of Blofeld, Donald Pleasence was always my favorite because you finally get to see what Blofeld looks like after these few movies of build-up, minus Goldfinger, because Goldfinger was its own standalone movie, finally get to see what he looks like. And when he's revealed, he has a scar running down his eye, and it just makes him that much more terrifying. His physical appearance in this movie just strikes fear into anybody who crosses him. And that's what I love about this interpretation of Ernst Stavro Blofeld. That's why I feel that Donald Pleasence Blofeld is actually more of a screen presence and more terrifying and more menacing than the next couple of Blofelds that come onto screen, especially Charles Gray's Blofeld, which, by the way, Charles Gray is in this. He plays a contact Bond has to meet named Dicko Henderson. Well, Henderson gets killed in this movie. The same actor is in Diamonds Are Forever. You know who he plays? Ernst Stavro Blofeld. I'm not knocking this movie for that. I would knock Diamonds Are Forever for that. That's them bringing back an actor who previously played another character in the Bond series. Yeah, that's happened before. Maud Adams, who played Scaramanga's mistress in The Man with the Golden Gun, actually came back to play the character of Octopussy in Octopussy. I know, that is a title. I'm not making that shit up. That is an actual legit Bond title. It really evokes what they did with Joe Don Baker in The Living Daylights, and then he's absent for a movie, and then he comes back in GoldenEye as a completely different character. So that's a whole nother thing for a whole nother movie that I'll talk about. But You Only Live Twice has some of the better action sequences in the Bond series, and one that I'm about to talk about is one that a lot of people actually don't really like. And that is when Bond is flying Little Nelly and he has to take out the Spectre helicopters. This is actually a really fun sequence. I love the way it's filmed. I love that we're getting aerial combat in a Bond film. I just love just how silly and ridiculous it is that Bond is in this little small aircraft and he's taking out these big like fighter. It just goes to show Bond's witticism and Q's smart technology. That I've always loved that scene. I never really understood why people criticize that scene. And you know what? Despite the seriousness of the series so far, yeah, sure, we have a little bit of lavishness, slight over-the-top ridiculousness in the previous few films. This one just kind of goes for it. It's a little bit more out there. It's got a bit of a sci-fi element to it, honestly, and I really appreciate that about You Only Live Twice. As I said, I'm really curious to see, when I actually get around to reading the novel, where Ian Fleming went with his novel in terms of the plot. Let's go back to Blofeld for a minute, because another thing that just makes him so menacing is that he just kills Mr. Osato, and then he kills Spectre's number 11, Helga Brandt, in one of the most brutal ways possible. That's actually something I don't like about You Only Live Twice. I think that was kind of unnecessary in this movie, that she just got eaten by piranhas. Watching Osato die at the hands of Blofeld just proves how evil Blofeld is, and it proves how evil he is when he actually does kill Helga Brandt, but it just doesn't really fit in with the actual narrative of the movie. As I said, despite how entertained I am by You Only Live Twice, I don't think that this is a perfect movie. It's nowhere near as good as Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger, but as I've stated, I like it more than Thunderball. However, There are some aspects of this film, one that I just mentioned, where Helga Brandt dies, and I just think it's a bit unnecessary and a bit brutal at the time. There are other aspects of this movie that don't really sit well with me, as I've kind of hinted at already. The second half of this movie is completely different from the first half, where Bond has to become Japanese, and he has to marry a Japanese woman, and he learns like ninjutsu, and then he has to infiltrate Blofeld's volcano lair. That part of the movie is where I think the movie comes to a screeching halt. That's where it gets really lavish, really ridiculous, really over the top, and I've never really liked that portion of the movie. I've always thought it was a bit weird. That's honestly why in previous viewings, before these last few viewings, why I never really liked You Only Live Twice and why it was so low on my list. However, this is by no means as bad as what happens in Moonraker, for instance. That entire ending of Moonraker kills the entire movie. With Bond becoming Japanese and then marrying a Japanese woman, that doesn't kill the movie for me. I think it is justified within the script, even though it is a bit ridiculous, outlandish, and over the top. It's really weird when you look at Bond when they give him the Japanese makeover, because I've always thought Bond looked like Spock when that happened. So it's just a little bit out there and weird, and it's one of the weaker aspects of the movie. But again, it doesn't kill the movie for me. Another aspect of this movie that I think is very weak, unfortunately, this is the first time I'm saying it in these reviews, Sean Connery. Sean Connery is definitely the quintessential James Bond. When you think of James Bond, I think of Sean Connery or Daniel Craig as James Bond. Even Pierce Brosnan, because I grew up with the Pierce Brosnan era of James Bond. However, you could definitely tell when making this movie that Sean Connery just didn't want anything to do with James Bond anymore. You could tell he was so disenchanted with the role. You could tell he wanted to move on to bigger and better things. There's even accounts of him not being on speaking terms with one of the producers, Albert R. Broccoli, during the production and filming of this movie, because apparently they had a falling out over contract demands and salary demands, and he was just like, you know what, I've had enough. So you can definitely tell in Connery's performance in here, while it's not bad, that he is getting a bit annoyed at playing Bond, that he is becoming disenchanted. And he cited his reasons as to why he wanted to leave the role as because he wanted to try other things and he was afraid of being typecast. So completely understandable, but he is not as good in this movie as he is in the previous 4 movies. And there's sometimes within the script where the story just doesn't seem like it's progressing all that much. I feel like trying to adapt this and coming up with an entirely different story from the novel kind of hindered the writing of this movie a little bit. It almost felt like the screenwriter, Roald Dahl, didn't really know what to do. He really even said he used Dr. No as an inspiration. He was like, I just kind of brought Bond back to the basics and made a basic Bond film. And at times, you can definitely tell that this feels like a basic Bond film in that regard. Those are really my biggest issues with You Only Live Twice. Again, I gotta say, I feel like everybody expects You Only Live Twice to be one of the lesser Bond films in the series, but for me, it's really not. It's a really entertaining and engaging Bond film. It's got a lot more action than the previous 4, especially a lot of action, especially for its time. This is the most action-packed of all the Sean Connery Bond films. It's got a really menacing villain. It's got one of my favorite characters in Tiger Tanaka. It's got some really great villains with Osato and Blofeld, but you can definitely tell that they went back to the basics because they didn't adapt the plot of the book. Sean Connery became a bit disenchanted, and there's a bit of weirdness in the middle of this movie where Bond has to adapt to Japanese life. But again, I do like this more than Thunderball, just not as much as the first 3 in this series. And I am going to give You Only Live Twice a B. It's definitely one of the better Bond films. You get past some of its lavishness and ridiculousness, I think you'll really have a good time with You Only Live Twice. And if you really don't like You Only Live Twice, please give it another rewatch or another couple of rewatches, and I think you'll really come around to it, because that's exactly what happened with me. It was so much lower on my list, and these last couple of rewatches really warmed up to You Only Live Twice. Thank you for watching my review of You Only Live Twice. I'm having a lot of fun talking about the James Bond movies. I hope you guys are having a lot of fun watching them. Up next in this series is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Oh boy. And then after that is Diamonds Are Forever. What has this world come to? I can't. Why do I have to talk about these? Why did I choose to talk about James Bond? Anywho, stay tuned for those reviews coming very soon. I will leave my links to my website in the description below. You guys are the best. Thank you for watching. My name is Alex Madden, and I'll see you at the movies somewhere.